Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar and book talk. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the current director of the Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies here at Columbia University. And greetings from a snowy New York. It is an absolute pleasure to be here for this book talk, virtual event, where we are listening to and celebrating the publication of Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II by Professor Francine Hirsch. And the book itself was published late last year by Oxford University Press. Professor Hirsch is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches Soviet modern European history. And some of you may know her first book, also a really impressive achievement, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge of the Making of the Soviet Union, which won several prizes. And today's event has been envisioned as, after an initial presentation by Fran, a dialogue with our own Miriam Schulz, who is currently a PhD candidate at Columbia in Yiddish Studies, and she is on an Association for Jewish Studies dissertation completion fellowship for the year. And Miriam will provide some commentary. Maybe I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions, then we'll open it up to you for your questions in the second part of the event today. So thank you again, Fran. Thank you again, Miriam. I know you're both very busy, but we're really excited for this conversation. And to learn more about this, absolutely fascinating topic. Fran, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a native New Yorker and spent a lot of time up at Columbia University and the Harriman Institute back in the day, and it's great to be back, if only virtually, right? So I've been asked to start things off with an overview of the book's main themes and arguments, and so that's what I'll do. So let's just get right into it. So the Nuremberg Trials, also known as the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, took place in the wake of World War II from November 1945 to October 1946 in occupied Germany, and we're now in the midst of marking its 75th anniversary with all kinds of commemorations. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And they also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. Now, this was just the first of the Nuremberg trials. It would turn out to be the only 4-power one. The 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial and the judges trial, were carried out by the United States alone. And for those of you who may have seen the film Judgment at Nuremberg, that's actually based on the judges trial. And I think that's one of the reasons that in the United States especially, Nuremberg tends to be remembered chiefly as an American story. But what I want to suggest today too is that there are other reasons why the Soviet role in the Nuremberg trial has also gone underappreciated, including restricted access to the former Soviet archives during the Cold War, including concerns about Nuremberg's legacy, and also I would suggest just our discomfort with historical complexity, right? The Soviet role was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, and perhaps especially the Americans. And these included the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish officers who were prisoners of war, on the Nazis. In a more general sense, too, the contribution of Stalin's Soviet Union to Nuremberg kind of upends the myth of Nuremberg as something that was fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. So, but what I argue in the book and what I'll argue today is that we need the full story of the Nuremberg trials. The real story is messy. I think it's also incredibly interesting. And I also think that it's necessary because Nuremberg still matters. It's still being invoked all the time, right? About like, let's have a Nuremberg trials for this, let's have a Nuremberg trials for that. And in some cases, in a serious way when it comes to crimes against humanity committed by other states as well, right? For some, it remains a kind of gold standard for international justice. For others, it's an appalling example of victor's justice that should never be repeated. But if it's going to offer any kind of meaningful lessons for the present and the future, we need to understand what actually happened. So my book aims to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. It draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. This evidence includes things like transcripts from the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It includes secret telegrams from Nuremberg to Berlin to Moscow and back again with detailed directives. It includes letters, diaries, surveillance reports that give us a sense of the everyday life of the members of the Soviet delegation as well, their first impressions of Nuremberg, the nightlife, shopping on the black market. It includes things like possible lists of possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution and their depositions. And it also includes documents like marked up copies of the indictment and marked up copies of the judgment and other documents that the Soviets had secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval. We see the tremendous contribution of the Soviets to the framework of the trials and also to the prosecution's case. But we also see the many ways in which Soviet participation threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. The book also aims to use the Soviet picture and the Soviet archives, combined with other sources, to tell a richer and more nuanced story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. Looking at the relationship, I argue, among all 4 countries of the prosecution really opens things up, right? There were 4 prosecution teams at Nuremberg: American, British, Soviet, and French. There were 4 main judges, each representing one country of the prosecution. And while I think we often tend to think of Nuremberg as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, right, like any good law case, it was also a contest among the countries of the prosecution for power and influence and control over the narrative of the war. That relationship, those relationships among the prosecutors, among the judges, between the prosecutors and the judges are all highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice, right? What was justice? And compromises made on all sides. We see the importance of the nightlife and the parties with the endless flow of alcohol. This is actually really significant, I argue, for keeping things congenial and sometimes for keeping the trials on track. We also see how the Nuremberg courtroom became a front of the Cold War. So let me just say a bit now about the narrative arc. The book starts in the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations that were held in London about the Nuremberg Charter that set out the IMT's framework. It then focused on the equally contentious deliberations about the indictment that set out the charges, along with a whole narrative of the history of the war. And it then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the organization's case, and then the judgment, which to the dismay of the Soviets resulted in several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period and at deliberations about international law and human rights. Now, my aim with this book was to tell a good story and to introduce readers to a new cast of characters who they might not have heard of in relation to the Nuremberg trials. We see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of the Soviet filmmaker Roman Karman, the playwright Vsevolod Vishnevsky, the political cartoonist Boris Efimov, and other Soviet correspondents. Some, like Harriman, have been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps, and they bring those experiences with them, right, to Nuremberg. We also see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions. Vyshinsky had been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow show trials of 1936 to 1938. Major show trials in which Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Andrei Vyshinsky spent only 1 week in Nuremberg, and what a week it was, his influence there was constant for the Soviet delegation. Along the way, I make a number of arguments, and I'll just briefly note 4 of them here. Argument number 1, okay, has to do with Nuremberg and the history of international law. And again, I'm going to be very brief, and we can return to any of these themes if people are interested later. So argument number 1, without the Soviet push for a special international tribunal and Soviet ideas about international criminal law, the Nuremberg trials likely would not have happened. It was the Soviets who had been out in front during the war, pushing for a special international tribunal. It had been the Soviet jurist Aaron Trainin who contributed critical arguments about crimes against peace, about the illegality of launching aggressive wars, and critical arguments about conspiracy, criminal responsibility, and the defense of superior orders. And these ideas fundamentally shaped the IMT's framework. Argument 2 has to do with Stalinism. I argued that the Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion and were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given. They thought that the victors would control the script. Key members of the Soviet delegation, including Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko and Soviet Judge Yonin Nikitchenko, had cut their teeth on the Soviet show trials of the 1930s, right? That was what their experience was, but they had no experience with the finer points of a Western-style trial, including cross-examination. Stalinism left the Soviet delegation unprepared in other ways too, and I'll just briefly give 2 examples, right? One had to do with suspicion. The Soviets didn't have enough interpreters and translators, in part because the NKVD, the secret security forces, had shot German speakers before and during the war. The other has to do with secrecy. Soviet leaders shared information with Rudenko and Nikitchenko and the whole delegation only on a need-to-know basis. They didn't bother to tell Rudenko about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939, in which Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide up Poland and the Baltic states, because again, they didn't think it would come up in the trials at all, even though Ribbentrop was one of the defendants. Okay, argument 3. This has to do with the Soviet understanding of the Holocaust, which I think we'll be talking about more today as well. At Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust and what at the time was talked about as Hitler's final solution. This Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial, spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews. And in part because of the Soviet Union's post-war anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign, right, that was launched after Nuremberg. But the Soviet prosecution's presentations on crimes against humanity and the testimony of Soviet witnesses like the Yiddish poet Avraham Sutzkever told the story of the annihilation of the Jews, while integrating it into a larger narrative about the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the German-occupied East. And the last argument, which I'll touch briefly on, has to do with the Cold War. I argue in the book that the Nuremberg trials became an early front of the Cold War, and that there are 2 elements to this that I look at. First, I look at how the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom in March of 1936, with the news of former Prime Minister Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, right, which happened to coincide with the start of the defense case. I look at how this bolstered defense efforts to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And I also show how at Nuremberg, the Cold War and the struggle for human rights became completely entangled. And I look at the way in which this shaped and ultimately stifled subsequent deliberations in the United Nations and other institutions about turning the Nuremberg principles into permanent international law. So again, that's just a brief overview of some of the main arguments and the main themes, and I'm happy to talk about any of them more later. And I'm really actually mostly eager to hear Miriam's comments. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Miriam, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the Harriman Institute and of course to you, Francine, for your amazing work and for having this conversation today. And yeah, this is my commentary. Nuremberg has been haunting me for quite some time in the form of the Soviets' most important witness, Avraham Sutzkever, the one that you already mentioned. So being a scholar of Yiddish, the Holocaust and the Soviet Union, conversations with other Yiddishists often move towards appraisals of Sutzkever, probably the most important Israeli Yiddish poet of the post-war period. No surprise so far, he was a very good poet, and these conversations could become especially interesting for me if they turn to his Soviet period. Sutzkever's wartime experiences are extraordinary. He was imprisoned and terrorized in the Vilna ghetto, managed to escape and joined a partisan unit, was then able to smuggle his poetry to Ilya Ehrenburg in Moscow, who in turn organized for him to be airlifted to Moscow in March 1944. His arrival in Moscow received wide public attention. His Yiddish poetry was included in Yiddish publications and even released in Pravda in Russian translation. He became a prominent member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and the face of Jewish suffering and, more importantly, survival in the Soviet Union. And then in 1945, he was chosen to testify in Nuremberg about the Holocaust in Lithuania, and his testimony remains one of the most memorable. He then left the Soviet Union and moved to the young state of Israel. So, though, as you can see, there would be a lot to discuss. What these conversations usually boil down to is one thing. Sutzkever was forced to speak Russian in Nuremberg instead of Yiddish. Being one of the few Jewish witnesses to be included in the proceedings, he scribbled in his diary, and I quote, "I feel a tremendous responsibility. Our mother tongue must be heard. It shall triumph in Nuremberg as a symbol of our immortality." On an aside, he noted that, and I quote again, "I'm not that strong in the Russian language that I could transmit the quivers of my soul." Now, of course, I believe that all witnesses in Nuremberg should have been able to testify in their mother tongue. Testifying about traumas of the scale Sutzkever experienced should at least be made as comfortable as possible when it comes to language. There are further issues we could discuss, and Francine has already hinted at them. Namely, why did the tribunal lack translators of the very language most Holocaust victims spoke, namely Yiddish, while Polish-speaking witnesses, for instance, were able to testify in their mother tongue? What further does this tell us about the importance of the Holocaust in these proceedings and about Jewish fragility in the early Cold War? But before all of this, we should probably acknowledge that it were the Soviets, not the Americans, nor the British or French, that decided to give Sutzkever the platform to testify and make the Holocaust part of the proceedings. It was, in other words, the totalitarian regime that, as Cold War narratives and Holocaust scholarships tell us, completely suppressed discussions and memory of the Holocaust and universalized suffering, Jewish suffering, as but one part of the overall Soviet suffering, anti-Semitic to the core as this regime allegedly was. Holocaust memory is something that distinguishes the West from the East, and one of the many things that made the West better than the Soviets. The storyline tells us as well. In this vein, the dominant discourses of the post-war years, in these discourses, the suppression of Yiddish in Nuremberg is often construed, with the help of Sutzkever's post-war writings, as the turning point of Soviet policies against Jews. Again, these narratives captured one significant moment in order to miss the story, I argue. As we know, Stalin unleashed unprecedented anti-Jewish purges 2 years after Sutzkever testified between 1948 and 1953 against primarily Jewish intellectuals, without debating Stalin's cruelty and the suffering of Soviet Jewry. What we can see in the real-time and post-factum debates about what happened to Soviet Jewry in these years is similar to the way Nuremberg equalized the Soviets with Nazi perpetrators. While Molotov-Ribbentrop and Katyn put the Soviets on par with Nazism in Nuremberg, Stalin was now pictured as being hand in glove with Hitler in regards to the Jews as well. Sutzkever himself would call Soviet policies against Jews, I quote, perpetual pogrom in peacetime, thereby invoking Trinin's concept of war against peace himself, and others would simply call it a second Holocaust. With the help of the Nuremberg script, I argue, another Cold War myth was created. Jewish culture can only prevail outside of communism, turning the fight to rescue Soviet Jewry into one of the most important Cold War campaigns. For a scholar of real existing Soviet Yiddish culture and its anti-fascism until 1991, this narrative is an almost unsurmountable obstacle. Beyond the trial itself, then, it seems that the myth of Nuremberg provided a powerful framework to judge and criminalize not Stalin, but communism as an ideology by putting Soviet crimes on par with Nazi crimes, with the help of Soviet legal concepts themselves. And it introduced whataboutism as a legal strategy. The important second step would be to turn the table. What has all of this to do with us? Francine has shown that the legitimacy of the trial was one of the major concerns of the Americans afraid of accusations of victor's justice. Thanks to the moral superiority, so the story went for a long time, they gave the Nazis a fair trial, which gifted the world the last utopia of human rights. Fran complicates this narrative significantly, of course. But I would like to question the distinction the book draws between Soviet show trials and Western open trials. At the face of it, the distinction is very clear, of course. Soviet show trials are nothing more than a didactic ritual of publicly performing a guilty verdict that was already determined in the beginning. The open trial, in contrast, is presumably objective, evidence-based, undecided in the beginning, immune to the emotions of witnesses. But by naming the Nuremberg trial an open trial, don't we perpetuate the very myth we attempt to dissolve? Hannah Arendt famously said in connection with the Eichmann trial, another show trial no less, that, I quote, justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done. Theatrical devices are therefore inherent features of any trial, as many other scholars have argued. It is not about whether, but which ones were employed in Nuremberg by the Americans and for what end. The end was, amongst others, to hijack the trial, colonize the evidence, marginalize the Soviets, and judge them in concert with Nazism. Therefore, couldn't we describe the Nuremberg trials as a perpetuation of appeasement towards fascism and an early form of the Hollywoodization of the spectacle of Nazi white supremacy, not primarily in order to fight or destroy the latter, but in order to claim Western world leadership in a specific historical context? Wasn't the trial the Soviets wanted to use to judge fascism as a spawn of capitalism, made into a theatrical arena that gave Nazis a platform in the service of capitalism? I think ultimately we should foreground ideology much more than just a battle for power and influence. And ultimately I wonder, and I know this might bring me into trouble, what is the bigger scandal? To rightly presume Nazi guilt and have a short trial accordingly, or to give them a platform to defend themselves and their ideology under the pretense of moral superiority. Moral superiority of what exactly? A choreography of this is not America, does little to actually fight fascism head on. And this is, of course, very much about the current moment as well. Thank you so much.
Miriam, thank you so much. So just a word to our audience, please use the Q&A function if you have a question for Fran or Miriam or both, and go ahead and type your questions into that box. I will ask a question too, but before I do, I want to give Fran the opportunity to respond to some of the comments that Miriam has made.
I just want to say that was a brilliant comment. So thank you so much for reading and engaging with the book so thoughtfully. You've actually asked so many questions that I feel like I'm going to be thinking about for quite a long time. So I'm not going to do justice to your comment today, but I just want to say that I think you put a number of really interesting and really important things on the table. So I'll just say that, first of all, this question about Sutzkever testifying in Yiddish, right? That this is indeed one of the issues that came up at the trial itself. So for me, it's always about the documents, right? Is there a document that shows like why he was not allowed to speak Yiddish at the trial? And from what I have seen, it was mostly just, he wasn't the only person who was denied speaking in a language, in a preferred language, if he actually knew one of the languages of the tribunal. And so from my understanding of this is that if someone could speak fluently enough, right, in one of the 4 languages of the tribe, and they had so many problems with translators and interpreters and simultaneous translation, right, that was what they were required to do, and not just in terms of the Soviet witnesses, but all of the witnesses. So this is something I actually would love to see more research on, in terms of just, I want to go back and look at the nitty gritty of who else was not allowed to speak in a language that they wanted to speak in. So that to me just opens up a very interesting research question. And I find it fascinating that has become like this pivot point for so much that's built upon it, when in fact, I think it's a research question, right, that we still don't know the full answer to. So that's really interesting. I think also I've just that question about how the trials became a mouthpiece for Soviet propaganda. I think that is such an incredibly important point, and something that I've been thinking about a lot right now, actually. Just even like not to bring it all up to present day politics, but when there are present day discussions about people on the alt-right and with like these nice photos of them, and they make them look like these really interesting people that maybe you want to get to know better, right? It reminds me of some of the big photo spreads on the Nazis that AP was doing at the time of the trial, right? And the Soviets were absolutely furious about this. And there's at one point when one of the Soviet correspondents writes home that he had approached Jackson about this, complaining, like, why was this allowed, that the Nazis were given such a forum? And he took it as anti-Soviet as well, because some of the Nazis who were being given a forum were like Wilhelm Keitel, who was then talking about how the war against the Soviet Union was a preventive war, and then just really, and Goering was espousing all kinds of ideology, and on and on. And Jackson was basically, well, you know, it's a free press. You know, newspapers have to sell papers. Like, we can't control what the newspapers do. You got to make a buck. And so this, again, it's which again, and you understand why the Soviets are absolutely like infuriated by this. And just I'll say too that the Soviets early on in the deliberations about the London Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, they had wanted there to be specific clauses forbidding Nazi propaganda. And they did not, this was not, the other countries of the prosecution did not go along with this. They just thought, like, I mean, they argued, oh, the judges will shut them down. Like, the judges aren't going to let them go off and go on and on and on. And so when the judges didn't shut them down, Goering was allowed to testify for 2 weeks, on, and focusing so much of his testimony actually as an attack against the Soviet Union. Yeah, I mean, that was that moment in March. I think you're absolutely right. That was that moment in March, that turning point where the Soviets feel that the Cold War is coming in, that they see this as this moment at which the judges, the Western judges, because they're constantly outvoting Nikitchenko 3-1, that's how it's interpreted, that this is a Cold War thing, that they have decided to just like kind of open the floodgates and have all of that negative attention and negative propaganda be focused on the Soviets. So, and there's something to that. There's absolutely, so yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting, this question of thinking like, what is a show trial, right? And what is a show trial? I mean, there have been scholars who have written a lot about didactic justice, for example. There are different understandings of what a show trial does, a show trial that's supposed to educate and enlighten. And we tend to associate the show trials, of course, with a certain kind of Soviet show trial. And that's why it's a delicate thing, because in Nuremberg, right, the defendants are guilty. In Soviet show trials, that was not necessarily the case. And so I feel like we almost need a different vocabulary for like a Soviet style show trial versus a didactic trial. And Nuremberg was absolutely a didactic trial from start to finish. And the Soviets thought it was going to be one kind of didactic trial where it was open and shut. And it turned out, yeah, you're right, absolutely. It turns out to be a different kind of didactic trial that's more about Jackson steals the show, right? In terms of the narrative that then emerges. So I just I want to talk more with you, whether it's about in this forum or at a later point, because I just, again, thank you for those wonderful comments, and maybe we can open it up and then come back to some more of these as well.
That sounds great. We actually have 3 questions, so let's open up and I'll hold off on my questions too. I had to sort of, going through them. So first one's from Andrew Smelter. Did Stalin later express his thoughts on Nuremberg? Did he regret it taking place, especially given all the kind of unintended consequences in the process that you document?
That's a great question. Someone asked me in another interview if there are sources that I wish that I had been able to see that I hadn't. And my reply is always, yeah, I want more sources about what Stalin thought, right? So Stalin, I don't know, because I have, again, for me, it's about the documents. And so I haven't seen documents of Stalin saying like, we shouldn't have done this, this was a bad idea. What I do know is that midway in the trials, at that point, Stalin's furious with how things are going, right? And at that point, and we know this not because Stalin wrote down, or maybe he did, but I haven't seen something where Stalin says, I'm furious with how things are going. But we know this because key members of the Soviet delegation are called back to Moscow. They have meetings with Stalin. And at that point, after that, the Soviet case changes. Because the Soviets then are told to introduce new evidence. They're told to take more of a stand against this argument of preventive war. They're told not to let the Americans carry so much of what's happening. So Stalin is carefully paying attention and monitoring things and marking up documents. We know that Stalin was not happy with what the judgment looked like, because Stalin and Molotov, again, the judgment it wasn't supposed to get back to Moscow. It was supposed to be a secret document in Nuremberg, but it gets back to Moscow and it makes a whole round robin. And then in the end, the judgment it's not what the Soviets had wanted. But in terms of, I'd love to see that, like some secret Stalin diary. So, but we don't have that, unfortunately. Yeah.
But maybe I could add something to the kind of deep legacy of Nuremberg in the Soviet Union. I think this do exist, even maybe in the legal system itself. Like if we think about the show trial against Jewish intellectuals in 1952, they could testify. It doesn't mean that, of course, it wasn't decided from the beginning, but testimony was suddenly a very important part of it also, right? And I think, and that's why I think foregrounding ideology is so important, what Nuremberg actually vindicated is everything the Soviets thought about fascism. That it's basically the root cause is capitalism, and capitalists are always kind of hand in glove with fascists. And ultimately, Nuremberg proved nothing else. So when we think about how, for example, the Holocaust figured in Soviet media after Nuremberg, it was exactly that story. And you could always point back to Nuremberg. So I think there is kind of also this myth, or maybe it's not even a myth, in the Soviet Union of Nuremberg that had like real-time consequences in how the Cold War was fought, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Miriam.
Great. Next to Hakang Yang, who asks an interesting question. What's the relationship between the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials? For the Soviets in particular, did they apply a similar method and agenda in Tokyo? Was there any interaction between the two?
So the Tokyo trials were different in that there were many more countries of the prosecution that were involved. I don't remember if it was 12. I don't remember right now offhand, but there were many more prosecutors. There were many more judges. It was a very different process. There's some overlap of personnel. So there's one Soviet assistant prosecutor who then goes on and is involved in Tokyo as well. And there's also Konstantin Gorshinin, who is a member of the secret Soviet team that was overseeing the Nuremberg trials. He was actually also involved then in the Tokyo trials. But I haven't studied the Tokyo trials enough to know in detail. But I think it's just also different in the sense my sense is in terms of where the Soviet focus was, the Nuremberg trials were just seen in the Soviet Union as just a major event that everyone was supposed to be paying attention to. They obviously weren't, but that this was the moment. It was Germany. Whereas I don't think that the Tokyo trials had that large a role in the Soviet imagination. But there are scholars now who are doing really interesting research on the Tokyo trials, and I'm eager to see what they come up with. So I think in that sense, I don't know yet. I'm waiting to read the new books.
So actually, I'm going to ask a question here, and I see Jonathan Sanders has a question too. But just coming off of that, and that is one of the fascinating arguments you make is that all for, I mean, you know, there were a lot of expectations and misunderstandings and ideological incompatibilities and power plays. But one point you returned to is this idea that, you know, the four teams were representing four very different legal cultures. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, you know, there weren't really comparativists as much amongst these sort of teams, that, you know, they each, you know, value their very own kinds of, you know, processes, normative ideas of what a trial is for, justice relation between prosecutors and judges and so forth. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that. Like, what are some of the practical frictions that, you know, these different kinds of legal cultures sort of created, and why wasn't this issue sort of, you know, flagged beforehand in a more kind of sort of, you know, structured way?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And it's something I spent a lot of time talking with international law colleagues to try to figure out some of this while I was working on the book, just in the sense that, again, when we think about these different legal systems, the French and the Soviets came from more of a civil law system, and the British and the Americans came from more of a common law system. That meant all kinds of different things. And there are issues that come up like very early on, in part with the writing of the indictment, which, you know, the indictment is it lists all the charges, right? But in the Soviet and the French system, the indictment also contains all the evidence. Whereas in the American and the British system, the indictment just lays out the charges, and then the evidence is presented in open court. And yes, I mean, it was initially, they didn't realize that they had different understandings of what an indictment was. And so it took a while for them to even figure out that they weren't on the same page, right? And then negotiations about, okay, well, what should the indictment look like? How much should go into it? And so they go along with the indictment is huge, right? They end up including lots of evidence in the indictment, but they decide that they're not going to include all the evidence in the indictment because more evidence might become available. Well, and boy, did more evidence become available. So the Soviets and the French think that most of the evidence is being included in the indictment. And then the Soviets, they get to Berlin, London, where they're working on the indictment. And then they're just amazed by how much more documentation there is. And then they're also surprised once the trial gets going. Again, the Soviets think that the Americans are going to present their case in a few days. And then the British are going to present their case in a few days. And then the French, again, it's going to be open and shut. They're just going to get the evidence out there and they'll be done with it. But the Americans go on for months because the Americans say, well, we didn't include all of the evidence in the indictment. And then so they lay out, you know, day after day after day after day of all of this evidence. And the Soviets are like, ah. So that's part of it. Also cross-examination. Again, it ends up being very difficult for the Soviets who are not used to cross-examination. Other things too, like the relationship between the prosecutor and the judge. In a Soviet trial, the judge isn't actually involved in prosecuting the case because they've reviewed the indictment ahead of time. It's sort of understood that what's going to happen during the case. And the expectation at Nuremberg was that the judge was going to be more of a neutral party. It's actually really like interesting little tidbit that's not such a small thing that Nikitchenko was originally supposed to be the Soviet prosecutor. And so he was involved in the Soviet early deliberations about putting together the indictment. And then Stalin makes a last minute decision that Nikitchenko should be the judge instead and sends Roman Rudenko as the prosecutor. And the Americans are appalled by this. They think like this is like highly irregular. How can someone go from being the prosecutor, having seen the evidence, to being the judge? And the Soviets, they have no problem with this at all. So there's the difference between the legal systems, but then of course there's also what the Soviets are expecting Nuremberg to be. Now, I'll say briefly too, that when we think about Soviet law, we've been talking now about like show trials, but that's not the whole Soviet legal system, right? The Soviets have a very complicated and interesting legal system and some kinds of trials that we would recognize, some like other kinds of courts. But it's the fact that they sent to Nuremberg for the prosecution and as the judges, people who had more of that show trial experience shows more what they had in mind. Aaron Chayinin, who I had mentioned, the Soviet legal expert, the jurist, Now, he was someone who did have experience studying all different kinds of legal systems. Aaron Trainin he was a jurist. He was based at the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He actually had spent time studying in Germany. He spent a lot of time in the 1920s in Germany, studying with German law professors. He knew many languages, was an expert on Western law. So he ends up he's involved in all kinds of legal aspects of the case, and also is a consultant to the Soviets throughout, kind of helping them to figure out some of these issues. So no, the law piece I found very interesting, and there was really a lot to untangle there.
I would have
Please.
a question connected to that. There was this agreement among the prosecutors that is called like a gentleman's agreement. So I'm really interested in that gendered component of like the history of the Nuremberg trials. You could write a whole book about that probably. So yeah. So
the Soviets were the ones who refer, I'm not sure what this was, because I think this is one of those very interesting moments in general. So that it was agreed in the Nuremberg Charter that the Nuremberg trials would only deal with European Axis crimes. Okay, so period, which is part of why the Soviets are so furious when things shift. But Jackson understood that he had word about maybe the secret protocols. We're not sure exactly what he knew, but that he knew that there were some things that might come up during the trials. He also knew that there were issues with the British and Norway, for example, and some issues with French war crimes. And so before the trials start, a couple of weeks before, it was because the prosecutors have these regular meetings to discuss the case and to work on things. And so they have a meeting, and he proposes, look, we might want to circulate lists of sensitive topics that maybe I might need to know about, so that I could consult with my government and let people know, so that we know how to react, so that we're not taken by surprise if the defense tries to bring things in during the trial. And so the Soviets are kind of a little ahead, like, what does this mean exactly? And back in Moscow, Andrei Vyshinsky, who's the head of one of these secret Nuremberg commissions, they work out this list of what they don't think it as they don't call it their list of war crimes, they call it their list of taboo topics. And the list of taboo topics includes things like the Soviet Union's relationship with Poland, the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, and all of its details, right? We know what all of its details stands for, right? Things along those lines. And the Soviets, so the Soviets, again, they have all of these people who are acting as kind of informant types, writing all these secret telegrams back to Moscow about what's happening in Nuremberg. And one of them, by the name of Mikhail Kharlamov, who's diplomat, he's the one who uses this term gentleman's agreement. So he writes back and he says, like, you know, we had when he writes this later when things start to go wrong, when all of a sudden Soviet-Polish relations and the details of the non-aggression pact are coming up in court. He says that, like, we had this gentleman's agreement and that this, like, what's happened, that's no longer standing. But that's what about that. But you asked another interesting question about the gender relations in Nuremberg in general, which is a whole nother, it is a really interesting topic. There's another scholar who's working on a project of women in the Nuremberg trials. And some of these other delegations, I know from a really interesting presentation she gave, Diane Amen is her name. She gave a super interesting presentation talking about how members of the lawyers, there were female lawyers on the American delegation. I don't remember if on the British or French as well, but they were not allowed to speak. Like that, they had a kind of a more of a quiet role, right? And then the Soviet delegation, the female members of the Soviet delegation, we're mostly talking about here like stenographers, typists, and translators. Tatiana Stupnikova has an incredible memoir of her time as a translator. So, and again, it's really interesting as well in some of the correspondence back and forth, like where the women mentioned, there's again, this one in this correspondence, they write back how the women are shabbily dressed, the women members of the Soviet delegation, and the British and the Americans rather are making fun of them. So it comes up in those kinds of ways. But yeah, it would be really, really interesting to look at that in more detail, the whole gendered aspect of it.
Right. So let's turn to another question. This is from Jonathan Sanders, who actually does a nice piece of institutional memory for us when he says, "Oh, to have John Hazard's insights into this." He was a student of Wyszynski's, among others, in 1930. So thanks for that. And he asked, on the comparison of the Moscow trials in Nuremberg, isn't it at the perils of live events? On the comparison of the Moscow trials in Nuremberg, isn't it at the operation level one great difference, as far as this reported professor knows, that torture was not a pillar of the Nuremberg trials?
Yeah, all I can say is absolutely. Although I think that there are some questions about some of the Soviet witnesses and what they had experienced. And again, I don't know the answer to this question, but it is a question, because remember that some of the Soviet witnesses, or some of the people that the Soviets had in custody, were people like Friedrich von Paulus, who then went to Nuremberg to testify, Buchenhagen. So there were others who were in Soviet custody, and I don't know what they would have experienced. And even if it wasn't physical torture, they were definitely interrogated multiple times by the security forces before it was decided that they could go and testify. And so again, it's not a question of saying that they gave false testimony. That's not the case at all. But I would say that but then when it came to Katyn, and because again, this is where we get into that really tricky complexity of things, that the Soviets presented falsified evidence about the Katyn massacre, blaming the Germans. And the Germans petitioned to be able to call witnesses to dispute this evidence. And the tribunal agreed, overruling Nikitchenko, so 3-1 ruling. And so the defense was able to bring 3 witnesses, and the Soviets were also able to bring 3 witnesses. And I don't know what the witnesses, that some of the Soviet witnesses, they gave false testimony, right? And so again, and the Soviets made a big point about only sending witnesses who could stand up under the pressure, right? Who were reliable. Right. So yes, it's dramatically different from the Moscow trials. We're not talking about the same thing at all. But when it came to Soviet witnesses, I think that, again, like, what are the archives that I'd love to still have access to? It would be knowing more about how those things played out behind closed doors back in Moscow.
And then I think, one other area that's really fascinating here, just some of the lasting institutional legacies that that Nuremberg leaves. And of course, in the international relations committee, field, we think of this as the cornerstone of, attempts of, transitional justice in the future. It's always sort of, the first chapter in these sorts of efforts, the kind of, very successful image put forth by Jackson and so forth endures. I'm wondering how you view bringing the Soviet piece back into this complicates our understanding of Nuremberg's legacy, and how we should, really re-narrate. I mean, it's kind of it's sort of a double victor's legacy, so to speak, in some ways, right? But I'm wondering if you thought of that and about that, and how, how now, and that's one part of it, and then the second part of it, in Russia at the moment, how is the topic and the gap addressed? And I'm wondering what kind of reception your book has had there so far. So that's a lot, but
no, those are 2 amazing questions. Yeah. So I'll start with how my book has been received in Russia, which is, I don't know, and because it hasn't been translated. I'm hoping at some point it will be translated. I've been in touch with a few friends there, and I've sent them copies of the book, but I don't know. And I think it's tricky, right? Because again, in Russia right now, Putin has there's this big commemoration, the 75th anniversary commemoration of the Nuremberg trials. And so much of that is about a narrative, again, like bringing in, and the Soviets have actually released in connection with this, for anyone who's interested and who reads German and reads Russian, there are all of these new amazing websites now where they've released just tons of archival documents that had been closed before, but it's very specific, right? It's not all of the documents. It's the documents about Nazi guilt. that's what's being released. And so, and part of the new legislation that, again, these kind of presidential directives and Putin's fascinating, very long article about the memory of World War II that was published in the West as well, right? It's a narrative about Soviet victory. It's a narrative about Soviet suffering. It's the same kind of narrative that they wanted to have at the time. And to talk about things like Katyn, to talk about any kind of an equivalency between Nazi crimes and Soviet crimes, right? Like one can get into trouble. So again, it'll be interesting to see and how much that plays out in reality. In terms of the legacy here, I think that's super interesting as well. And it's also something I've been thinking about a lot. Again, this is a big 75th anniversary year. And I've been tuning into some of the big commemorative events, and I've participated in a couple of them, but we still really have this narrative of American leadership, and it's an American story. And even Christopher Dodd, so the U.S., one of the U.S. assistant prosecutors was Thomas Dodd, and Christopher Dodd, the politician, was his son, and he published something in the New York Times talking about the legacy of Nuremberg and his father. And others talk about the Nuremberg trials as if Jackson was the chief prosecutor, kind of almost forgetting that there were these other prosecutors in other countries of the prosecution that were involved. It really is strange, this kind of memory of it as just this American story. And I kind of think, well, do people want to know my story? Do people want to know about the role of the Soviets? Does that just kind of mess up this? Like, again, do we want historical complexity? Is historical complexity helpful? And I would say that yes, we need it. We want it to show that 4 countries were involved, and these negotiations were very difficult, but they did negotiate in order to be able to, I think what they achieved was significant. So, and those achievements in terms of the legacy that I think are important, it's this record, the record that we have, a written record, a recorded record of the trials, a record of these crimes, so that if there are still Holocaust deniers out there, so that we have this record, I think is highly significant. And I think that Nuremberg did pave the way for future discussions afterwards about crimes against humanity, human rights, genocide, that have put a lot of that on the table. And even though there are still issues about state sovereignty to this day, right? I think that just in getting that conversation going and in getting movement towards international law, I think that was highly significant. And I think significant too, then, in terms of what civil rights organizations in the US were able to do, and dissident organizations in the Soviet Union, of using some of that language of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, genocide, to be able to make their own cases for equality and their cases against the hegemony of the state. So I think that those are all significant. But yeah, I'd like in general for the narrative to shift to include more of the 4 power negotiations. But I think there's pushback. I don't know, Miriam, what do you think? I mean, do you think that it messes it up in a, I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, well, maybe I should just, stop talking about the Soviets. Like, you bring Katyn and you bring the secret protocols, and then like, what happens to Nuremberg? What do you think?
Well, I think obviously we need historical complexity, but we don't want it. That's for sure. And I think it's a broader question of if it's possible of having a self-reflexive memory culture in general. It seems like that is an oxymoron. It's not possible. Even in the German case, which is, of course, all about German guilt, it is actually just an instrument to then again claim superiority. We overcame that, and now we're on top of everything and again. So what we see with Russia right now is just a mirror image of what has been happening since Nuremberg, I would say. For example, they are publishing right now a lot of material on Sobibor, exactly because there's a monument, I think a memorial being built in Sobibor. And of course, they want to be part of that narrative now. Last year, there was a big scandal in Yad Vashem, where there was a Russian video completely rewriting the story of the war as we know it. So what we see is really the deep legacy of the Cold War, where exactly these kinds of memory politics were playing out as well, just that we don't know the Soviet story of it. So obviously this is where my work tries to come in, but I don't know if anyone is actually interested, unfortunately.
I'm interested. I'm very interested. I think it's going to be really important work. And yeah, I think it's complicated in the United States as well, right? It is, especially when you want to have all these commemorations and all these celebrations and these big 75th year, and then, but I don't know. I do keep thinking about that too in terms of like present day politics and like what does it mean to cooperate with states that you might even think of as criminal regimes in the name of something greater. Like, you know, maybe there's a lesson for cooperating with states we don't like to accomplish climate, you know, to deal with climate change or to deal with COVID or to, in the name of some kind of legislation that might open the door to human rights, to you know, more widespread legislation about human rights. Go ahead.
But more importantly, I mean, it is a question also about fascism. And this is a very relevant point, of course. Like, why do we need to make discussions about fascism, about Antifa, for example? Of course, I would say these two things are connected still. It's still about this whataboutism. The left is much worse. It's kind of really the Nuremberg script still happening on a daily basis, you know? So how to confront fascism? By being also self-reflexive about kind of the contribution of capitalism in its rise, you know? These are questions that I'm wondering.
Yeah, that's really important. And that's one of the things that you're right, that never really got dealt with at Nuremberg. And that was one of the, again, in terms of thinking about the question about like, what did Stalin think, right? Mm-hmm. Like one of the great Soviet disappointments about the trial was that there were industrialist trials after Nuremberg, but the Soviets had very much wanted industrialists to be tried. And the Krupp case fell apart so that didn't happen. And then they were not involved in other four-power trials about that. There's a really interesting Soviet memoir by Arkady Poltorak about the Nuremberg trials. Mm-hmm. And he spends a lot of time actually talking about that failure to take on capitalism. And then of course, you know, we know that then some of the Nazis are brought over to be involved in scientific development in the United States after. So it's, right, the whole paperclip incident. So yeah, there's a lot there to think about.
Right.
So we are almost at time. This absolutely fascinating and rich conversation. I want to say a few thank yous. First, I also forgot to thank Book Culture, our local independent bookstore, for helping us to promote this event. So if you'd like to order Professor Hirsch's book from them, you can do so via the tab that is in the chat. Also would like to thank the History Department at Columbia for co-sponsoring this. And of course, I would like to thank Fran and Miriam for this fantastic dialogue. And I wish you both success with your book and your projects coming up. And hopefully we will see both of you soon. And thank you to the audience for spending your lunch hour with us. We look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Thank you again for yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.